Off we go. So, Jim, sorry for the
Okay,
interruption. Back
no,
to
no
you.
problem. Very good. So we're going to be doing a virtual tour of the Kauffman Farm, a very, very important farm. The noted architectural historian G. Edwin Brumbaugh called the Kauffman Farm the most complete Pennsylvania German farm. And I don't know if I would quite agree with that, but it is a wonderful place. Currently, the farm consists of 120 acres with 14 buildings and a number of other really interesting cultural landscape features as well. Um, and I have to apologize to David when I sent him the information about the talk. I said that the farm was owned by the Kauffmans for 250 years. I was actually incorrect. I'm sorry, David. I sent you bad information. The farm was owned by the Kauffman family for 271 years.
Open it. No.
So actually, it was owned from 1726 until 1997 by the Kauffman families. Quite remarkable. The Kauffman Farm is now owned by a nonprofit organization called the Friends of the Kauffman Farm. And later, I'll give you some idea of what we want to do, and as far as the preservation of the farm. So let's talk a little bit about the setting of the Kauffman Farm. The Kauffman Farm is located in eastern Berks County in the Oley Valley. Some of you are familiar with the Oley Valley. Some of you might have been on tours that I conducted through Oley. It's a wonderful place. The valley itself is based on the Schuylkill River, east of the city of Reading, and extends north about 7 miles north of the Schuylkill River. So it's quite a large area. It's really a significant cultural region. It was settled in the early 18th century by both German-speaking settlers and English as well. There were English Quakers, there were English Anglicans, there were Swedes, there were some Holland Dutch, certainly German, Swiss, and some French Huguenot settlers as well. Quite an interesting place. The lower end of the valley consists of two townships side by side, Exeter and Amity, which were largely English settled, but to the north is what is now Oley Township, and Oley Township was the area that was really settled primarily by German speakers within the first decade of the 18th century. What is now Oley Township really is the great limestone section of the Oley Valley. It's excellent farming yet today. Many working farms in the valley today. There's also an incredible amount of historic preservation in the Oley Valley, particularly in Oley Township. As you drive through the area today, it's very pristine, and you can see a number of 18th and 19th century buildings and working farms used in a traditional manner. Interestingly enough, Oley Township was the first township in the United States which was placed on the National Register. So the entire municipality was placed on the National Register due to the great historic preservation and the level of preservation that exists there. Certainly by 1725, there were a number of owners of farms in the Oley Valley and in Oley Township in particular. By 1750, the township was completely settled, completely being farmed, and a very dynamic place. Now, in 1726, our story sort of begins with David Kauffman, who acquired a tract of 370 acres of land. And in the image on your screen, the area to the left here really encompasses most of that 370 acre tract, or much of that 370 acre tract. The tract is really located pretty much in the geographic center of Oley Township. Today it's located along Kauffman Road, which you can see illustrated here. Kauffman Road runs east and west and connects two main north-south routes through the valley, Covered Bridge Road to the east, and not on this picture, Route 662 to the west. Now, I don't want to get into a huge genealogical discussion of the Kauffman family, but we have to talk about some of these Kauffmans to understand the ownership of the farm in the 18th and 19th century. David Kauffman, as I mentioned, acquired the 370 acres in 1726, and he owned that farmstead until his death in 1762. Following his death, the farm passed to his son, Jacob Hoke Kauffman. And I'm going to call this particular Jacob the First, because in fact, the next three owners of the farm were all named Jacob. The Kauffmans were a little bit like the Landises. The Landises tended to name everybody Henry. There were many Henry Landises here on site. Well, there were many Jacob Kauffmans in the Oley Valley. But David Kauffman's son, Jacob Hoke Kauffman, who we'll call Jacob the First, owned the farm from 1762 until 1804, and was really responsible for building most of the current 18th century buildings that exist on the farmstead. Following his death in 1804, the farm passed to his son, also named Jacob Hill Kauffman, who owned the farm from 1804 until his death in 1843. And we'll call him Jacob the Second. So this second Jacob is pretty much responsible for the 19th century structures that exist on the farmstead today. This second Jacob was also, in fact, responsible for dividing the farm upon his death, and split that 370-acre tract of land, so that by the time that the second Jacob passed away in 1843, he had carved off parts of this farmstead. And if you look at the image to the left, and I think you can see my arrow here, my arrow is pointing to those buildings which we are going to be looking at this evening. This is what constitutes what we now call the Kauffman Farm. You see a complex of structures to the west, and this is a complex that by 1843 passed to a person named Isaac Kauffman. So the farmstead was split by Jacob II, and his son, the third Jacob, received the farm that we're going to be talking about tonight. His other son, Isaac, acquired this farmstead as well as 250 acres, and then the third Jacob acquired 120 acres. And that's 120 acres which goes with the farm today. Jacob Kauffman, the third Jacob Kauffman, owned the farm from 1843 until his death in 1852. And following this third Jacob Kauffman's passing, the farm passed to three more. There were three more generations of Kauffmans, but none of these Kauffmans resided on the farm or worked the farm. They lived elsewhere, and the farm became basically occupied by tenants. The land was cultivated by tenants. Tenants lived on the farm, and tenants, housed livestock in the buildings. So that after the third Jacob Kauffman's death in 1852, there really was very little major construction on this farm, which I believe is one of the reasons why the farmstead today is essentially a pre-1852 setting. And I think it's quite remarkable and really quite unique. As I mentioned, following the death of the third Jacob Kauffman in 1852, there actually were three more generations of Kauffmans who owned this farm. The last Kauffman owner, David B. Kauffman, passed away in 1997, and following his death, two individuals from the Oley Valley, Doctors Frank and Carol Zarko, acquired the farm in 1998. The Zarkos were incredible stewards of this farm. They actually lived elsewhere on another property in the Oley Valley, and after 1998 and until 2019, they were involved in very careful stewardship, some very careful restoration and repairs to the farmstead. In 2019, the Carol Zarko essentially deeded the farm to the Friends of the Kauffman Farm, and of course we now own it now. Now, of course, the image to the right is a blown up view of the farm as we look at it now, and again it is set on the current acreage of 120 acres. Again, the original tract was 370 acres. Again, what happened with the second Jacob Kauffman was that in 1832 he built the first part of this farmstead to the west. 1832 built the farmhouse and allowed his son Isaac Kauffman to move into it. Some other farm buildings were constructed, and the second farm started operation. 2 years later, in 1834, the second Jacob actually added on to the early house on our Kauffman farm, moved into that section with his wife as kind of a retirement quarters, and then handed this farm over to his son, the third Jacob Kauffman. And then, following the death of the second Jacob Kauffman in 1843, the actual division of the farm took place. So we're going to be actually looking more closely now at the buildings on this part of the farm that we have today. And let's go to this next view. So some general comments about the buildings that exist today on the Kauffman farm. The surviving buildings on the farm essentially date from 1760 to 1900, and actually there are only a couple of buildings that date as late as 1900, but most of the buildings 1760 to 1900. The dates of the building are a bit inexact. We are undertaking a lot of research right now on the farm, and we meaning the Friends of the Kauffman Farm, eventually hope to have historic structures reports and other research reports done on the farm to be able to more accurately date the structures. The other thing is that while there are about 14 structures on the farm today, what we don't know, of course, is how many other buildings may have stood on the farm previously. We know that there certainly are foundations that exist of buildings that have been taken down. Pretty much all the buildings that stand today are limestone, but we know that there were log buildings on this, at least one log building on this farm. There may have been earth-fast structures. There may even been half-timbered structures which have disappeared. So we have no idea of how many other farm buildings may have stood on this farm. The buildings today generally are oriented to the south, including as you can see, the main house here and this ancillary building, which we're going to be talking about later. And the roof lines of the houses are generally parallel or perpendicular. So these buildings were not placed willy-nilly on the landscape. It was a planned construction of these structures. The buildings would have been built by professionals, and when we talk about individual owners like the first Jacob or the second Jacob building the structure, we don't mean that they themselves actually built the structure. They would have hired professionals to build these buildings. Essentially, on the current 120 acre tract of land, the earliest buildings are sort of on the west end of this tract, and they tend to be centered around a great spring which still flows today. And then the farm sort of expanded to the eastward in the 19th century. And here we look from the back of the main farmhouse towards the east to a number of current agricultural buildings and barns in the distance. The stone used for all the buildings is local limestone. In fact, it's very possible that the limestone was actually dug from the site itself. There is an area where limestone may have been quarried on site and would have been the building stone used for these structures. There were a number of changing economics to agriculture in the Oley Valley in the 18th and 19th century. And those changing economics had great influence on the Oley Valley, and certainly had great influence on this farm itself. We know that in the 18th to early 19th century, farming in the Oley Valley was generally based on wheat. So wheat was really the cash crop. Of course, these farmers were growing a number of different things, but the wheat was the cash crop. And so the wheat was being grown locally, harvested, converted through mills into flour, and then that flour was being wagoned to Philadelphia. And the Oley Valley is only 50 miles from Philadelphia, and there was a lot of really close connections between the prosperous Oley farmers and Oley and Philadelphia. So the wheat flour was being wagoned to Philadelphia, and while some of the wheat flour certainly was sold domestically, massive amounts of wheat flour were being placed on ships and out of the port of Philadelphia, shipped not only to the Caribbean but also back to Europe as well. And by the early 19th century, other agricultural products were also being shipped out of the port of Philadelphia for European markets. I recently read a quote from the Duke of Wellington, who during the Napoleonic Wars, of course, was commanding a British army fighting the French in Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. The Duke of Wellington said that if it wasn't for American agricultural products coming in through Portugal, that his army in Spain would have starved to death. Pennsylvania farmers were certainly part of that economic trend, and so in the 18th to early 19th century, wheat was the crop that was really producing money and prosperity for these Oley farmers. But that changed. By the mid 19th century, Pennsylvania German agriculture and certainly the agriculture of the Oley Valley changed to dairy, and for a number of different reasons. There certainly was the rise of cities, and also the betterment of transportation. Railroads were coming into play by the 1830s and early 1840s, and suddenly dairy products the farmers had the ability to ship their dairy products to these burgeoning cities, and so by the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, a change was happening, and the agriculture was moving from wheat-based to dairy-based, and of course, you can see that on the landscape with the construction of the large dairy barns, and we can certainly see that on the Kauffman Farm. We'll talk about that a little more when we get into looking at the barns.
Jim, I wanted to just remind everyone, for those of you who have questions on the content or what you're seeing, please place your questions into the chat box, and as they come forward, we'll either pass them along to Jim or wait until the end of the program. So again, with questions, please place them in the chat box. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, fine. So this is a view of the main house on the Kauffman Farm. And the earliest part of this house is the right-hand section, from here to the right. And we've assigned a date of 1763 to this building, but that is not a hard fast, but certainly early 1760s. And then there's a section of this house to the left, which we know was built in 1834 because a date stone exists. This earliest section of the house to the right would have been built by the first Jacob. The 1834 addition to the left was built by the second Jacob. Now, I don't know if you might be able to see a kind of an outline in the grass in front of this building. There was a remnant of a foundation uncovered here during some archaeological investigation, which seemed to indicate that there was an early log house occupied that site. And it's very possible that was the site of a log house built and lived in by David Kauffman, the original Kauffman owner of this farm. And so we have perhaps the site of the earliest structure, but then of course the second generation larger prosperous a two-story stone house with centered chimney, with again the 1830 addition onto the left. This 1763 section of the house is a traditional Pennsylvania German three-room floor plan house, central fireplace, and we'll talk a little more about that in a few minutes.
Jim, on the gable end of the picture, it's a little hard to tell. I see the window, but above the window at the top of the gable, is that a stone plaque?
Right here?
Yes.
No, that is another opening. And
okay.
in a minute, I'll explain what that is. There are
Okay.
unfortunately no date stones on this house. There is a date stone in the 1834 section. The 1763 date comes from a tile that we found on site with that date inscribed in it. And of course, it is a year after the first Jacob, acquired the property through as his father passed away. So it's certainly a possibility that that 1763 relates to the actual construction of the house. But there are no date stones on the main house, and I'll explain that in just a minute. That's actually another opening on the upper gable of the house. This is, of course, a view of the rear of the house. Again, we're looking at the back of the 1763 section with the 1834 addition, and you can certainly see that certainly the roof line of this earlier building is higher, and is actually a steeper pitch. You also get a sense of the central fireplace, central chimney, and of course the stone. We believe that the back of the house was always exposed stone. However, it's very possible that the gables were stucco. There's a small remnant of stucco on one of the gables of the 1763 house, and we believe that it's very possible that the gables were in fact entirely stuccoed. So here's another view again of the rear of that 1763. We're calling it 1763 section, built by the first Jacob Kauffman, and you get a sense of the fenestration and the steeply pitched roof, and again that central fireplace. And again, it's very possible that these gable walls were completely stuccoed at one point. Now, let's talk about this second opening, which David so astutely discovered. The fact is that this attic is a double attic, so there are actually two attic levels under this roof line. And I was talking about the fact that Pennsylvania German farms were based on the wheat economy in the 18th century, and where did the farmers store their grain? The barns, which dated from that period of time, were really quite small. But in fact, we know from not only documentary evidence, but also physical evidence that many of these houses with these double attics, that the attic actually was the granary on the farmstead. And it's very possible that this upper opening accommodated a hoist for hoisting grain bags up and into this upper area. It's also possible that this window was originally a door. So it's very possible that the attic of this house was the granary for the farmstead in the 1760s, 70s, etc., and that the second opening accommodated a hoist, and that the grain was hauled up and into this area. And you think about the attics of these houses as a granary; they were secure and they were dry, and the farmers were certainly keeping the source of their prosperity close at hand before they could deliver it to the Philadelphia market. So another view of the 1763 section of the house, and looking straight on, of course, it is an asymmetrical facade. So this is, of course, the main entrance, and when you enter this door, you enter a kitchen which spans the entire width of the house. This central fireplace central chimney serves a massive fireplace which opens into that kitchen. Now behind this fireplace to the right, there were two rooms. There's a very, very large room occupying serving which these two windows served, which was the Stube, and the Stube or stove room was perhaps the most important room in a three-room Pennsylvania German household. It was it's kind of a sitting room. It was also the dining room. It's where the family kept their best pieces of furniture, etc. Usually heated by jam stoves that were extended out the back of that central fireplace. And then there was a third room off of the kind of next to this Stube, and behind it. In most Pennsylvania German farmhouses at that time, with a three-room floor plan house, this smaller room off of the Stube, which is called the Kammer or chamber, served as the sleeping area for the owner of the farm and his wife. However, we don't believe that was necessarily the case in this house, because in the room directly above the Stube on the second floor is what is best described as a really grand room, with in fact some Georgian refinements. There is a fireplace on the second level. There's a corner cabinet with refinements that really harkens to a Georgian house. And so what we might have here is a real transitional house, one in which Jacob Landis was essentially living in a traditional way, in a traditional Germanic continental floor plan or a three-room floor plan house. And yet, rather than use that small room next to the downstairs Stube as his sleeping chamber, he made for himself and for his wife this grand sleeping chamber on the second floor. Again, we hope to find out more about how this house was used as we continue to delve into documentary evidence for the farm, as well as we really study the physical evidence as well. I should also say that the cellar of this house is completely excavated. So there's a cellar under this entire house, which is really somewhat quite unusual. In most center chimney three-room floor plan houses, the area beneath the kitchen was unexcavated. In this particular case, however, there's a barrel arch beneath the kucha or the kitchen, as well as a full cellar beneath this section of the house to the right as well. You also note that there's something about this facade. It's a very tasteful facade, and in fact, it almost looks like this facade is cut stone. It actually isn't. But the stones are pointed in such a way that it gives the impression of a very refined facade. And there's also a refined door hood, of course, the double hung windows as well. This was the home of a prosperous German farmer. And again, as I mentioned earlier, these Oley farmers had connections to Philadelphia. That they were gravitating towards Philadelphia. That was their market. And they were certainly being influenced by the style trends in Philadelphia. Just some window details from the 1763 section of the house. Most of the window frames in the house are original. Many of the sashes are original. There's a lot of original fabric inside the house. And kind of a really great detail is the sandstone surround on one of the cellar windows as well. I almost never go to the Kauffman house and walk around without discovering something new. I also want to say that our tour this evening is primarily a tour of the exterior of the house. Tim let it be known that he didn't want me to go 5 or 6 hours for this presentation this evening, but maybe sometime we can come back and do an interior tour of this house. Could certainly do an entire hour plus just looking at the interior details of this house. But there's a great deal of great original fabric on this building that survives both exterior and interior.
Jim, we have a question about the front facade,
Yes.
seemingly so formal. Someone is asking, would this be considered ashlar? Ashlar.
That's a good question. I've heard of ashlar, and I think that ashlar is a different type of stone. This is basically limestone, and I think they probably found some good square pieces of limestone. However, ashlar is usually a different stone. The Levant house in the Oley Valley does have ashlar, which is a different stone. Okay.
Yeah. I guess it is unusual to see the side facades so typical of the kind of construction, but to see this almost dressed stone
Yes.
on the street-facing facade,
Yes.
extremely unusual.
So we have a just another kind of a close-up view of the pointing on the facade of the stone of the 1763 building, and again this really great hood over the doorway as well, again from the 1763 structure. Okay, this is a detail of the framing in the attic of the 1763 house. This is a type of framework which is this is known as a Liegenderstuhl's truss system, and it's a very unusual. It's a type of truss system that is found in Europe, found in the Rhine Valley, and is usually associated with buildings that are supporting tile roofs. There are several other Liegenderstuhl truss system roofs in the Oley Valley. This is a truss system that is almost over-engineered. It's an incredible system, but it is capable of withstanding the weight of a tile roof. And again, we think that this house did have a tiled roof originally. Now, we also believe that there may have been another layer of floorboards laid across these beams here, giving this second level for storing grain on this upper level of the house. This Liegenderstuhl truss system is seldom seen by the late 18th century, and in fact, even if this was 1763, it would be one of the later examples of this system in the Oley Valley. So now we have actually the front of the 1834 edition, kind of contrasting the 1763. This is actually again the section that was built by the second Jacob Kauffman, 1834. And it's a kind of a building that you would commonly see, actually a tasteful building for 1834. This is actually a side entry Georgian, and again, very tasteful building, a gable fireplace. And you can see from the gable, this is the gable of the 1834 edition. It's a shallower roof line than the 1763 section of the house. Again, we believe that this became, for the second Jacob Kauffman, his retirement apartment, essentially. Now there is a way to go from the 1834 into the 1763. They did break open a doorway, but having a kind of a multi-generational arrangement was not uncommon in the Oley Valley or in Pennsylvania German farmsteads in general. So that essentially Jacob II, in 1832 built the farm up the road for his son Isaac, and then he added on to the main house. He and his wife moved in here, and he gave this house and the rest of this farm, the 120 acres, to his son Jacob, and he continued to reside here with his wife Susanna until their passing. Okay, so this is a building which we call the Ancillary house, or the Ancillary building, and as well as the Spring house. I believe that both these buildings are 18th century structures. There's some debate over the exact date of the Ancillary building. A number of people originally thought that maybe this was the original settler's house, replaced by the larger 1763 structure, but in looking very carefully at this building, That was certainly not the case. In fact, the ground level of the ground floor of this ancillary building was clearly used for food and various food and rendering and the processing of food. May have served as a summer kitchen. Perhaps there was cheese making or other food processing happening here. When you enter this door, you do enter into a workspace. There's a fireplace served by this chimney. On the opposite side of the fireplace, in this section of the ancillary, there's a spring. There's actually a trough in the floor, and the spring comes up here. Now, the upper level of this building, however, is different. The upper level was laid out as a dwelling, or at least a residence, maybe for laborers or for family members. And in fact, this upper level is laid out in a 3-room German arrangement. So this area up here is in fact a kitchen or a Küche, served with a fireplace served by this chimney, and behind it is a Stube and a Kammer. But you access the second level from behind this building. And as far as the date of this building, I tend to think this building dates from the 1770s or 80s. I know that some people have looked at this and thought maybe 1790s. Some historians have thought that it might be as late as 1810, which I don't believe that's the case. But I believe this is an 18th century structure, and I believe it was also built by the first Jacob, the person who built the main farmhouse. And this is the back of that ancillary building, showing the access to that living quarters on the second level. And again, that might have accommodated either laborers or other family members who were residing on this farmstead. So in front of the ancillary building is this great spring house, and the spring that comes up under the ancillary building is a very powerful spring. It flows through a trough in the floor of the ancillary building, kind of comes out and fills up this pool, which has been known traditionally as the trout pond. Then the spring enters this spring house, and this entire spring house would have been used for cold storage, crocks of dairy products and other perishables. And then the spring exits the front of this building. I also think that this building is an 18th century structure and was probably also built by that first Jacob. By the way, this spring house is much larger than spring houses on other traditional Pennsylvania German farms. So as we delve into some of the primary documents relating to this farm, inventories and things like that, I hope that we can eventually figure out what was going on economically on this farm, because this is this very, very large spring house. This is another view again of that combination of the spring house with the ancillary behind, and again the spring flows, from the ancillary into the spring house, and then from the spring house out. And this is another kind of pond of spring water here. It's kind of an interesting arrangement of the ancillary with the spring house in front of it. I really don't know of another farm in the Oley Valley with this arrangement, and I'm not familiar with any other arrangement elsewhere on an early Pennsylvania German farm with this kind of arrangement of these ancillary buildings. So the spring flows, from the spring house towards Kauffman Road, under Kauffman Road, and then down, and it kind of forms a stream beyond. And you can kind of see it flowing here. I have a close-up view here. It may be hard to see, but there's just fragment after fragment of redware from pottery and crockery that flows down through this stream. So here's a little structure that's very, very fascinating that's set up right next to the spring as it flows through here. This little structure actually houses a mechanical ram pump, which actually pumps spring water from this spring about 100 yards to the farm of Isaac Kauffman, that farm that was set up in the 1830s. So that it's a mechanical pump taking the spring water about 100 yards back up the road, up Kauffman Road to the Isaac Landis farm. A very, very interesting survival. Other structures from the 18th century on the farm include this great bake oven, which is built directly behind the 1763 house, and this is a fully intact squirrel tail oven, very, very similar to the oven that is demonstrated at Landis Valley. This oven is in pretty good shape. You can almost use this oven. But another example of an 18th century structure, again, probably contemporary with the 1763 house. And this other stone building that sits also behind the 1763 house and behind the bake oven. And we do not know what this building was used for. It might have been a workshop. It may have housed a trade. The function of this building is unknown at this point. We do know that there was a blacksmith shop on this site. However, the blacksmith shop stood elsewhere on this farm and has been taken down. So this is not the blacksmith shop, but this serves some other function that at this point we don't know. It's interesting that it is sort of attached to this great garden wall, and this is the kind of this garden wall as it's attached to this other ancillary outbuilding whose function we do not know at this point. Again, in the distance is the bake oven, the ancillary house, and the spring house, and all these buildings that are basically 18th century buildings are sort of clustered at the west end of this property, adjacent to the spring. Other interesting survivals include this privy, which probably dates from the very early 20th century. We haven't really done a lot of investigation on this building, but the privy stands behind the 1763 house. And there's also a rubble of a foundation, which may have been a smokehouse that stands, as you can see, adjacent to the ancillary building and the spring house. Again, we don't know how many other structures may have stood on this farm in the 18th and 19th century. We hope, again, at some point to be able to discover other foundations and reveal other buildings. This structure is a barn, and it's probably the earliest barn on the property. It actually stands across Kauffman Road from the 1763 house. So it's a barn that probably relates very closely to the building, to those 18th century buildings. Unfortunately, there was a fire in this barn in the 19th century, and so the upper superstructure burned, and it was replaced with kind of a late 19th century framing and siding. This was originally a stone bottom barn with a log superstructure, and is most likely 18th century. It was not a bank barn, it was a grain barn. But it's of a barn, a type and size that is kind of very similar to the kinds of barns that you find on farms relating to wheat farming. So that, in the 18th century, in mid 18th century, if you had a grain farm based farmstead, you really didn't need a huge barn. You had a barn that would house some draft horses and some equipment, and maybe a couple of cows, but that was it. And of course, some equipment, plows, harrows, and things like that. But you didn't need the large barns that were required for dairy farming. So it's very possible that this was the earliest barn on the property, and it may relate to, in fact, the operation of the farm when the first Jacob Kauffman was farming here in the 18th century. We do know that other barns existed in the Oley Valley that with stone and log. In fact, there's one that still exists in Alsace Township. I suspect that Chris Whitmer is listening to this program. So Chris, if you're in Alsace Township, you take Oley Road from Alsace Manor eastward, and you will pass a barn similar to this with the exposed log superstructure and a stone bottom. Some drawings exist of barns like this that existed in the Oley Valley as well. Okay, so these two barns are the these two barns exist at the eastern end of the farm, and you know, for many years, I and many other people kind of assumed that the smaller ground barn in kind of the front here predated the larger bank barn in the back, which is sort of a traditional dairy barn. And then a number of years ago, actually not that many years ago, maybe about 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to tour these barns with one Robert Ensminger. And many of you know the name Bob Ensminger. He was an incredible barn scholar. He was a professor at Kutztown University. He was a mentor. He was a lecturer. Bob unfortunately passed away earlier this year. He was in his 90s, but he was an incredible barn expert. And I had the rare pleasure of touring these barns with Bob. It was just he and I. And I was asking him about, you know, the date of these barns, and he said, I really think that these two barns were built about the same time. He says, I think they're contemporary. And the more I've looked at these barns, the more I actually agree that he was dead on. Bob felt that this small barn was a barn that housed horses, and of course the barn behind was a big dairy barn. And he felt that these barns probably dated from about the 1830s. Well, subsequently, I actually found the date 1827 carved in. Actually, Bob also found the date 1827 carved in a partition up in this dairy barn. And we don't know if 1827 is simply you know, someone carving you know, something in a partition, or if it really meant that it was when that the barn was built. But we're pretty confident that these barns were built certainly by the 1830s, and were probably built, in fact, by the second Jacob Kauffman, the same person who built the Isaac Kauffman Farm down the road, and the same Jacob who built the 1834 addition to the main house. You know, I would attribute both these barns to him. And so let's take a kind of a look at these two barns. And you know, one of the things, and Bob pointed this out, if you look at, you know, the comparison of this small barn and the dairy barn behind, they both have very, very similar roof lines and fenestration. They have very, very similar stonework. The wood framing, the molding is almost identical. The hardware is almost identical, and the roof structure is almost identical as well. It's very, very simple, common rafters and purlins, nothing special. Also, the treatment of the forebay. You know, the forebay is not a cantilevered forebay; it's more of a recessed wall that creates the forebay. And in both barns, the forebays are created in the same manner. Again, we attribute both these barns to the second Jacob Kauffman, probably in the 1830s, if not as early as 1827. It's just a closer view of the, I'm going to call it the horse barn. I'm going to use Bob Ensminger's terminology, both the front and get the gable end, get a sense of the fenestration. Most of this woodwork is original. Incidentally, this small barn is not a bank barn; it's a ground barn or a Grundsteier. Here's a view of the back of the horse barn, with these great arched doorways, and again the fenestration. And again, this is not a bank barn; it's a ground barn. This is an interior view of the horse barn. That is all manure in there. Of course, all the kind of all the stalls had been removed at one point. There are still wooden nailers in the wood that would have accommodated pegs to hang tack harnesses and things like that. And there's one more great detail from the interior of this barn that Bob Ensminger just was so tickled with. when he found this, and that is this detail. This is what's called a spriggle bar. That's spelled S-P-R-I-G-G-L-E, spriggle bar, and it's a bar that basically that lives within this pocket or this recess of the stone wall. But you can pull it out and pull it across, so that if these doors are open, you have a barrier to keep the horses or livestock inside. This is one that's still intact, and of course this has been here since the day the barn was built. You can't get this in or out without taking the barn apart. I know that I'm going way over the time, which I knew would happen, but I have to tell it. I have to tell you this story. I was giving a tour of this barn a couple of years ago, and I opened up the spriggle bar and slid it. I slid it so it would be, all the way in the wall, and I slid it a little bit harder, and it actually disappeared from view. And I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to retrieve that and pull it out. Luckily, somebody in the 19th century thought of adding an iron ring to the end of the bar, so you can reach in and grab that ring to pull it out again, and that it certainly saved me. But the spriggle bar is a great detail that still remains in this barn. Here's the front of the larger dairy barn, and as I think I mentioned earlier, by the 1830s, Pennsylvania agriculture was changing and had changed from wheat to dairy. There are a number of different economic pressures which caused that to happen. Certainly, the growth of the cities, the ability to transport dairy products to the cities from the country opened up vast markets, and farmers now were switching from grain to dairy, which meant they needed large barns. And if you drive around Oley, you're going to see a barn after barn after barn like this, built from the 1820s into the 1840s and 50s to accommodate these large dairy herds. This is of course, the back of the large dairy barn, and there you can see this is a bank barn. There's the ramp that accesses the back with these double threshing floor, and we've got a granary off the back. This is really a huge barn, and the interior space is really quite impressive. Again, if you think of the framework that formed the Liegenderstuhl truss in the 1763 house, and look how lightly framed these 19th century barns were. It kind of looks like toothpicks or something, but this is a very, very common 1830s framing with common rafters and purlins supporting the roof. And again, it was on one of these mal partitions that the date 1827 is carved into this barn. So between the 18th century cluster of buildings and the 19th century barns are three agricultural buildings. There's a stable or a shed, there's a pigsty, and there's a wagon shed that connect between the two. And these three buildings were either built by the second Jacob Kauffman before he died, or possibly they're buildings that were constructed by the third Jacob Kauffman in the few years that he was the owner of this farm. This is a close-up view of the roof, and of course this stable, which possibly was used for housing sheep or other small livestock. This is actually a timber frame building. The proportion of this building is curious because it really has the proportion of an 18th century structure. It's a very steeply pitched roof. However, when some restoration work was done on this building a few years ago, nails and other things from the 1840s, 1850s were discovered. I think it's entirely possible that this building may have been moved onto the farm from elsewhere. It certainly, again, has the proportions and the lines of an earlier building, but it was probably constructed here in the 1840s. Now, we know that, based on what they found here when they were doing repair work a few years ago, this building was roofed with the side lap German roof. These are German long shingles. They're lapped sideways, which is the traditional way that the Pennsylvania Germans roofed buildings in the 18th century. But this practice continued into the 19th century. And for those of you who are familiar with Civil War battlefields, if you look at photographs of the Gettysburg and also the Antietam battlefields from the 1860s, you will see photographs of buildings on those battlefields with side-lapped German shingled roofs. So these shingled roofs, certainly this practice certainly continued into the 19th century. This is the front and rear view of the pigsty. Again, possibly built by the second or the third Jacob Kauffman. Probably predates 1860, but it's hard to say. Unfortunately, many of these pigsties are falling down. And this is again, this building needs repair work, of course, but it is a kind of a rare remnant of a pigsty of this type. I can't think of many pigsties such as this that still exist, even in the Oley Valley. And two other 19th century structures. We get the wagon shed and corn crib at the far end of that row of agricultural buildings, and a building that was used as a chicken shed. Curiously, though, it is built on a kind of a limestone fieldstone foundation, and so it may possibly have been some earlier structure that was kind of repurposed. But these are the latest buildings that exist on the Kauffman Farm. Now, I just want to show a couple of views of the farm down the road, the Isaac Landis farm. Again, this is the Isaac Landis house. It was built in 1832 by the second Jacob Kauffman. In fact, he actually dated this building. There's actually a carved date stone with Jacob and Susanna Kauffman's name inscribed on it, even though he probably didn't even live in it. But this is a house that was built 1832. It's actually a center hall 4-square plan. It would have been a very tasteful structure for the 1830s, and typical shallow roof line of that period of time. One of the things that's fascinating about the I'll call this the Isaac Kauffman farm is the amount of building that buildings you'll find on this farmstead. This is a farmstead that continued sort of in its own way, in that the subsequent owners of this farm were farmers who lived here, that this was their full-time job, and so there was more and more of an agricultural development that happened on this farmstead. And you can see all the various number of agricultural buildings that stand, and this is still a working farm today. This barn on the Isaac Landis farm is almost identical to the farm on the barn on the Jacob Kauffman farm, and we haven't done some really close examination, but I would suspect that they were built by the same person.
Jim, could you please clarify, are both of the farmsteads owned by the trust? And we're also a little past 8 o'clock. Is it possible to kind of provide some brief insights into what the purpose of the trust is in terms of what they hope to be doing with this unique cultural landscape and this unique complex of buildings?
Yes, in fact, I am actually done. My next view is questions. So it was excellent timing. This farm is not part of what is owned by the Friends of the Kauffman Farm. So the Friends of the Kauffman Farm only own the other farm that we looked at with 120 acres. This farmstead is separate and it is privately owned. So as far as preservation efforts for the farm, it was the goal of the Zarkos when they purchased the farm in 1998 to preserve the Kauffman Farm for posterity, and they undertook very careful restoration. They had done some work. For instance, they created an apartment in the second floor of the Ancillary building to house people on site. But again, in 2019, Carol turned the farmstead over to the Friends of the Kauffman Farm. I should also say that There is an agricultural easement in place on the Kauffman farm. That easement actually took place when the Kauffmans still owned the property prior to 1997. So the farmland is protected through an agricultural easement. Our goal, the Friends of the Kauffman Farm, is to place very important restrictions on the preservation of these buildings. And we are actually looking to sell this farm to the right owner. So we want this farm actually to go back into private hands. We are looking for the right owner to acquire this farm, to very carefully undertake restoration and preservation, actually under our guidance. And these are restrictions that are being attached to the deed. This farm is actually currently for sale, and it is listed through Sotheby's. But we want to find the right owner for this farm. We want it to be preserved for posterity, and we know that the right owner is out there, and we're going to attach restrictions on how the buildings can be used, and we, the Friends of the Kauffman Farm, will actually have a say in guidance to how the buildings are restored and maintained.
Will the income from the sale be utilized for continued preservation of the Kauffman Farm, or will you use that as a seed funding to continue to preserve through covenants other historic farms and other historic agriculture?
Whether we use it for covenants for other farms is a possibility. Initially, we want to undertake historic structures reports and all the documentation and all the study that is required for this farm. So we want to use that money to fund the studies that are absolutely necessary for this farm, so that we can find out as much as possible. And there certainly might be ways in which we can use the farm in an educational way as well. It's not going to be a museum, but there might be times when the public could see part of the site. We certainly want to be able to open it up for scholars to study as well. It's a different approach to preservation for this farm, but we think it's the right direction.
It's not uncommon in some covenants that the owner is required by the basis of the agreement to open to the public 1 day a year or 2 days a year.
Yes.
Which would be advantageous, in that numerous folks on the presentation tonight are clamoring, yes, we want to see the interiors.
That's great.
And we have a participant saying that in Jacob number 2's will, he specified having a whole side of the house put aside for his wife after her death.
Uh-huh.
Okay, you're familiar with that. We have someone who's a descendant of the Kauffmans on the line. And she's asking when the double FF started. I'm not sure if I'm understanding what the double FF is.
Is she referring to written documents with a double S, perhaps?
I think she means single F in Kauffman versus double F in Kauffman.
Yeah, my last name is double F now.
Oh, I see.
Oh,
Yes.
I see. Okay.
I understand.
And when did it start? And I wonder why.
I don't have the answer to that question. I do not know.
I
Yeah,
saw
and
it in research going between the first Jacob and the second Jacob, but that
Okay.
makes sense considering the changes in more English-speaking people showing up and slightly working towards more standardization. But that doesn't mean anything. I mean, names keep changing all the way up until the 1900s, depending on who's writing them down.
Right.
And is there a Kauffman family cemetery on the property?
I know there is.
There is, yes. And I
Where?
don't have, the Kauffman Cemetery is, I'll tell you what, the Kauffman Cemetery is located, if you are standing facing the house, okay?
It's back in the back left, right?
It is on the top of the hill
Yeah.
to the
Right.
left. Yes, and it is a long walk, by the way. And of course, those fields are now being planted. But if you go there after the crops are taken off, you can walk up and see the cemetery. I don't have images of the gravestones tonight with me, but I know that I think the first and second Jacob Kauffmans are buried there. And I know that Susanna Kauffman is buried there.
So as a child, I remember playing here and being here. I never knew that my how can I say this? My grandfather's wife died giving birth to his daughter, and then he remarried and had my father. And I always knew we were related, but I never knew how much until we started looking into this.
I'm a member of Berks County Association of Graveyard Preservation, and we have had several recent cleanups at the Kauffman Cemetery. And what the gentleman is saying is true. Please be aware that access, you'd have to go through the private property and in order to cross to get up there. It's in pretty good shape, but the number of graves that are listed on Find a Grave and other websites does not match the number of graves that are actually visible and have stone markers. The ones that are visible pretty much have their pictures attached to Find a Grave. But like I said, there have been some entries added by volunteers that don't necessarily match up to what's remaining of evidence.
Yeah, I remember as a child being up there, and I'm 55, so I'm talking 40, 45 years ago. I remember being up there with my father and my grandfather at the time, but I can't remember everything that they.
It is a good hike up to this to the graveyard from the
It's on the
house.
very top of the hill, what I remember.
It is on the very top of the hill.
His aunt, my husband's aunt, lived there with her family and his uncle Irby, and they rented from them.
Okay.
And she was a Kaufman.
Okay.
So, but he can't remember what Uncle Irby's last name was.
Unfortunately, your parents kept stuff like that. I didn't know. I knew him as Uncle Irby, never knew why until the day my grandfather was buried on my 21st birthday. And then he explained it to us.
So, Jim, we actually have one more question about Oley and regional agriculture. Did the economic change to dairy also include, or was it part of the western expansion for the for grain growth? Does that make sense?
Are you saying that as far as westward expansion, the growth, the planting of grain in the West?
Or as you go westward through Pennsylvania, the old Northwest, through not necessarily going to the broad western expansion, but
Okay.
for the 18th and 19th century, as you see the march of civilization going further west into Pennsylvania and then Ohio, is there some kind of connection?
I am probably not qualified to answer that offhand. I'm not really familiar with the agricultural practices in Western PA and again getting into Ohio. So I don't know. I think that I think the growth of dairy in the East was a reaction to economic opportunity, and I think that some farmers continue to grow grain. Of course, I mean wheat was still grown and flour was still grown. But it didn't remain as dominant a cash crop. And again, I think that the growth of the cities and the transportation advancements in the East, allowing for dairy products to be moved to these population centers, was the motivation for the change to dairying, in the East. So I probably didn't answer the question, but I don't know that I have an answer.
Okay. And then someone reported that actually The property, as per your talk, is listed on the Sotheby's real estate website. And
Yeah.
if you go to Sotheby's real estate and search under Oley, PA, the Kauffman Farm comes up. There
Yes,
are
indeed.
45 pictures that are actually on the website, and they include photographs of the main house. You mentioned that the large kitchen and giant fireplace that you walk into from the front door, that's featured. The modern kitchen that was inserted into the spring house, and other images. So again, you can see pictures of the interior of the Kauffman Farm by going to the Sotheby real estate website.
Yeah, what's fascinating about that, again, I can come back and do a whole interior slideshow sometime, is that that the main interior of the 1760s building was never modernized. So yeah, the open hearth fireplace is still there. You could probably still use it if you wanted to, it's just kind of fascinating. There was a more modern kitchen installed in the 1834 edition. But that main 1760s house was not dramatically altered with modern improvements.
And then finally, as opposed to a type of stone, we have a definition for ashlar. Ashlar is actually masonry that's typically large cut stones, and more often than not used for facing on walls of brick or stone. It's not uncommon that every stone is individually worked, but it's finely cut, finely smoothed,
yes,
creating a smooth finish.
The Levan house in the Oley Valley would have what I would consider an ashlar front facade.
Okay. Those are all of the questions. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule, Jim, to
my busy
share.
Retired schedule.
Well, we've often heard that folks are busier in retirement than they were in their workaday world, but we greatly appreciate your time. Before we go, we have one more quick question, is that within the documentation that's known, is it known where a garden or a kitchen garden or a pretty garden may have been in relation to the house?
Yes, I don't know. I suspect that stone wall behind the 1763 building surrounded a garden area, but I don't know for sure. And hopefully someday we will be able to have some archaeology on site, and we will be able to discover where those gardens were located.
Great. Well, someone has kindly provided the link for the Sotheby's real estate website in the chat. So if you would like to see the house, or you're interested in bidding on a historic farm, you can go there. Also, like to thank our nonprofit, the Landis Valley Associates, for supporting us and supporting our subscription to Zoom. If you would like to see more programs such as this, or our return to live programs later in the year, there is a link to donate directly to the Landis Valley Associates. So, Jim, on behalf of myself and our crew, thank you so much for this walk through such a unique Pennsylvania German farmstead. For those of you who have never been to the Oley Valley, I'd highly recommend, now that it's springtime, get in your car, drive north of the Schuylkill, and then just drive west towards Reading, and you'll be seeing some really extraordinary agricultural landscapes and farmsteads.
Route 662 pretty much bisects the valley. So if you can find Route 662 and drive north. Great.
And then finally, the last of our presentations on historic agriculture will be this Thursday, looking at the founding and the growth of our heirloom seed project, and then providing helpful and handy hints for you to grow heirloom plants in your own garden, in your own backyard. To link up to the program and register, just go to our website and click on the link. So with that, thank you, Jim. And we thank you all for joining us, and have a very pleasant Tuesday evening. Good night, everyone.
All right.